You're listening to 3CR Radio.
Well, the LGBTI community here in Melbourne was rocked by the death of Yvonne Gardner recently. Yvonne was a legend in the people living with HIV/AIDS movement. She began lunches in the 1980s for people that continued until very, very recently. She was a community stalwart. She was at the centre of the HIV epidemic and really was a quintessentially Melbourne iconic figure. I'm joined in the studio by Brenton, Geyer, a friend of hers over many, many years. Brenton, you're a fixture in the community as well. You've been a writer, a performer, an events manager, and in all of your activities, Yvonne Gardner was never too far away as somebody in the community that you were supporting.
I was along for the ride very much with Yvonne right from, I think it was 1990 when I first met her. And she'd already hit her stride by that stage in terms of being a scene identity, a community identity, and as you described as the stalwart that she was to become. How do you talk about Yvonne in one conversation? Her influence on the queer community in Melbourne, particularly the HIV/AIDS community, has been enormous. She was multi-level sort of influence, but for me, the main influence, or the way I will always remember Yvonne, is that she was the ultimate party girl.
Indeed, and in fact her entry to the gay scene was in the 1960s on the party scene. I interviewed her many years ago for Brother Sister magazine, and she talked how it wasn't called the gay scene then, it was called the camp scene. You were camp. And she said there was a whole heap of parties that just revolved around certain houses in South Yarra, and that was the nexus of the community, and that was how she met her husband, and you know, basically this whole gay life.
Yes, she goes
erupted
back,
for her.
She goes back to before there was such a thing as a scene, as you say, and she was formative in creating the scene. When nightclubs and bars emerged and people came out of the closet more and more, out of those private parties and into public bars and clubs, she was right there. You'd often hear her before you saw her. The jangle of the chains around her neck and the jangle of her bangles that went all the way up the arm were a sign that she was on the way. And then you would hear her throaty, outrageous laugh, one that can only be cultured by a heavy smoker. It was a signature of Yvonne was her great, rich, hearty laugh.
You mentioned those bangles. They were pretty famous. Now, one of them I remember, it was a big, thick, white ivory bangle.
It was an elephant tusk.
It was from the 17th century, yes, she told me.
Yes, an amazing piece. And of course there's a lot of awareness now about game hunting and we don't do it and we don't encourage it. But back then in the 50s and 60s there wasn't that awareness of it being such a horrible thing to do. And it was a bangle that she never took off. It was a carved elephant tusk bangle that she never took off until it did split through age and probably being clanked on a few bars, and it did split, so she had to take it off.
There's a famous story of Yvonne at the Metro nightclub, actually, and it was the Village People concert, and she got up on one of the speakers and she was jangling that elephant tusk bangle. Amazing.
I think you're probably referring to the time that Midsummer brought the Village People out, and they performed at the Metro in Burke Street. Yvonne would have been on the board, as was I, at the time. Apart from her work in the HIV/AIDS arena, Yvonne sat on the board of Midsummer. She marched with ACT UP. She was involved in the candlelight vigils. There was barely or rarely a community group that she wasn't aligned with at some point. Even Bent TV, I recall. She was a roving reporter for a little while there. So there was barely a part of the community that she didn't touch in some way.
And in fact, she was on the board of people living with HIV/AIDS Victoria when it was called PLWA in the late 80s to early 90s. And she was the only non-positive person that was actually on that board. And it was because she was an honorary positive person because she was so linked to the HIV community and had done so much. Brenton, tell us how you think we'll look back on her contribution and her legacy to the HIV community in future years, because that's been huge.
She was a rebel. I think we'll see her as a rebel. We'll see her as an activist. She was pure grassroots activism and advocacy for people living with AIDS and HIV. She would go where no one else would. She would decamp out of the front of the Commission flats in Collingwood with a tub of with a pot of soup to feed people who were socially isolated due to their HIV status, and then much more to the point due to having AIDS. And this is AIDS, as we all know, is a very socially isolating condition, as is HIV. And often a lot of these men, and it was mainly men at the time, that were influenced by Yvonne's assistance, were cast out by their family and friends. And they really, that has an incredible mental health issue effect on these guys, as well as the physical issues that they're dealing with through HIV and AIDS. But Yvonne would feed them, take them out to clubs and bars, give them a life, give them a social life. And those little actions went on to become something much bigger when she formed her lunch clubs.
Of course, Yvonne was very active in the campaign to save Fairfield Hospital. And she was successful. And then, of course, the Kennett government came in and nothing was going to stop them from closing it. But they didn't stop Yvonne Gardner. What did she do? She sold her place in Malvern in the southeast, bought a place in Preston and started doing her North Side lunches. What can you tell us about those lunches?
Well, I went to several of them, particularly the Christmas Day ones, where if I wasn't eating the food, I was serving it at various times over the decades. They continue to this day. And Yvonne was shopping for her regular Friday lunches, even leading up to the week where she died last week. So, and I think they will continue in some form or other. Someone will take them on, because they're such an asset to people who are socially isolated, living with HIV.
So her lunches were happening, say, 2 weeks ago?
Oh, yes, indeed.
Wow.
Yeah.
That must be a huge shock, her death, to those people who are going to those lunches each week. Like, it's a shock to all of us, but to them, this just must be a disaster.
She was a mother figure.
She was.
And widely and appropriately often described as an Auntie Mame sort of figure, a larger-than-life diva, party girl, as I've described her. She is a self-described drag queen trapped in a woman's body. So you can imagine.
I remember her saying that.
Yes. And she wore that title as a badge of honour. There was very rarely a drag stage that she hasn't been on. When clubs through the 80s, 70s, 80s and 90s, like Pokies in St Kilda, would do fundraisers for the HIV Assistance Organisation, who provided grassroots care and support for people living with AIDS and HIV. Yvonne was often on the stage with the drag queens, belting out a couple of numbers, and often outshone a lot of the glamour of the drag of the time, and still does.
It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, she was just such a quintessential figure. And I remember the first time I laid eyes on her, there she was in these incredible brown leather pants. She wasn't just a drag queen, she was a leather queen as well.
She was one of the few women to get into the Laird Hotel. Or one of the few that was embraced, one of the few women who were embraced by the Laird community, the leather community, the bear community, etc. So she was a regular there in that scene too. Back in the 80s and 90s, a lot of those boys had HIV, developed AIDS. She was, as I said, very much a mother figure in their lives.
She wasn't without controversy. She was very active in the lunches at the Positive Living Centre when it was in St Kilda, and prior to that when it was in Paran. She also had her conflicts with VAC as well. Did she ever reconcile those conflicts, do you think?
I think she found her space in the sector as being a solo, almost renegade, grassroots operator, providing support where no organisation would. I remember her taking a bucket around nightclubs such as Three Faces, for example, and others up and down Commercial Road, and she wouldn't go home until that bucket was full of money, because somebody needed a fridge or somebody needed a heater. And that's where that's why I think she'll find her space in our memories, in our collective memories of her as a grassroots activist, and she didn't take no for an answer. She had, if some queen out there didn't have a heater with winter coming on, she would take a bucket through the nightclubs until she had enough money in that bucket to buy that heater.
She also opened her home to people living with HIV, and many people stayed with her. She was probably, an emergency crisis accommodation service as well.
She did play that role indeed, particularly with her large Victorian villa in Auburn Road, Hawthorn, as you described earlier. I was lucky enough to go there a few times. It was a magical place.
What was it like?
It was kind of like a ghost house. It had that aura of something mystical and magical and ghostly around it, because it was very dark and moody, and it was high style in terms of the way it was decorated. If you can imagine what she looked like, imagine that it turned into an interior, all very much of a time, all very high chic 1970s glamour, in this beautiful Victorian villa. And it was a time capsule, really. It's well known, and I'm not talking out of school, that when her husband Reg died very suddenly and very young, she retreated into that home a bit like Miss Havisham, and didn't change anything. So it was a time warp, a time capsule of another period, and I loved going there and fossicking around. She had the most magnificent collection of beaded purses and sequined handbags that she proudly displayed in a glass cabinet in her home. She had collections of everything, really. There wasn't much she didn't collect. So the house was full of exciting and exotic items to take your interest in, and the eye travelled everywhere, and everywhere the eye travelled there was something amazing to see.
It sounds like she was almost a cultural guide to so many gay folks as well.
Oh, absolutely.
An educator.
Oh, people saw her, as I said, as an Auntie Mame, someone who really didn't say no to anybody's influence in her life, no matter who they were, where they came from, or what they wanted to gain from their friendship with her. I saw her, as I said earlier, as the ultimate party girl. So that's what I gained from my friendship. Night after night after night, out with Yvonne, at bars, clubs. And she was still, in fact, the Saturday night before she died, she was at DT's to see the drag show. Of course, she knew all the drag queens. She knew all the scene identities. She was one of them herself.
What can you tell us about her death? Not much is known in the community about what happened.
I'm only learning the details as they emerge. She had a stroke. She had 2 strokes within quick succession of each other.
Oh dear.
She was a survivor. In every way, she was a survivor. She survived breast cancer. She survived bowel cancer. She was a very heavy smoker, a heavy drinker. She lived life. I saw her earlier this year a few times. She was looking old, and she was looking frail, and she was looking unwell, and she was going through the bowel cancer scenario. That was given the all clear. But come last Sunday evening, she had a stroke. She was taken to hospital via ambulance and had another stroke in hospital, and that finished her off. That's what I believe to be the case.
But she went quickly, at least.
Oh, she did. Yeah. But she had enough time, I believe, to give some very direct instructions about the way that she wanted to be remembered at her memorial service.
Tell us about that service. Tell us, do we know when it is yet?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Oh, yes, please do, because it's going to be huge.
It's just, well, I can tell you it's going to be huge. They've booked the Collingwood Town Hall.
Wow.
For next Friday, the 12th of October, I think at 2 p.m. That was announced only yesterday. If there is a Facebook event for Yvonnes Memorial that will have those details, but I'm pretty sure it's between 2 and 6 next Friday, the 12th of October.
Obviously, her death has touched you in a huge way. You must be going through a heap of emotions.
Well, it's something that was completely unexpected. We all thought that Yvonne was the type of woman who'd live forever, that would overcome any hurdle in her life, as she had overcome many hurdles in her life, many tragedies. That's not to say that her life wasn't without triumph too, and that's what we will celebrate. I think she will pack out the Collingwood Town Hall. We're lucky that the Collingwood Town Hall has a big stage, because I think that stage is going to be very active. I'm only imagining.
Who's going to speak? There must be people jostling for places.
I don't know. I haven't been involved directly with the organising of the memorial, but I think there'll be a cavalcade of speakers from all walks of life, because there's a whole other Yvonne that we don't know in this community. Yvonne as an auntie, a biological auntie. She has a family out there who I've been lucky enough to meet, and they're all as crazy as she is, as you can imagine. And they're the ones that we really need to think about too at this time. She's not. We didn't own her as a community. We claimed her as a community, but we couldn't own her. She had another life too. So that'll be interesting to see the coming together of all the aspects of her life, whether it be through her HIV/AIDS activism, her community work on various boards and committees, her life in the clubs and bars and drag dressing rooms and stages, and her actual family coming together from all around. It's going to be a marvellous day, and of course everyone's invited.
There's a new generation of queer folks who are growing up and doing incredible things, and it's amazing how many of them have actually been touched by Yvonne, especially in the arts community.
Oh, she was a Pied Piper. She attracted young queer kids, performers, artists, as you say. She attracted them like bees to a honeypot. And as a woman of 75, it was not rare for her to be surrounded by teenagers, young queer teenagers, which was marvellous. Like more than a mother, a grandmother in that respect.
What word comes to mind the most when you think of Yvonne?
Exuberant, selfless, or there's not one word, because there's a word for every part of my relationship with Yvonne. So exuberant was one part of my relationship, selfless was another. Someone who never said no, someone who, both. She never said no, never, and nor did she ever take no for an answer when she needed something. I remember her working the phones, raising money when I was working with her at the Midsummer offices in the 90s. If we decided we'd put on a fundraiser and we needed hay bales, which we did once, for country and western theme, she was on the phone to the hay bale people, and she wouldn't, and of course we weren't paying for them. If it was up to Yvonne, we wouldn't be paying for them. She would hustle things like hay bales for us for free. She'd hustle sandwiches and salads for our lunches when we were all as volunteers in the community. She was out there hustling. And so that's a good description of her, a hustler. I like that.
The gay community in particular fulfilled a need for her, obviously, but what do you think that need was?
You know, we all wondered that. What did this glamorous, exuberant straight woman want with the queer community? What was her link? The link is strong, obviously, and long-standing, right back to the 60s.
When she was in the thick of it.
She was part of the Lay Girls crew in Sydney. She knew all of those girls. She was part of the Pokies crew in Melbourne. She knew all of those girls. It was a drag connection. It was a gay men's connection, and more recently, it was a connection to all people queer, gender non-binary. The marriage equality campaign recently, she was front and centre with that too. So I often thought, what attracted her to us? What attracted a lot of the broken winged birds to her that she helped and helped mend? I don't know. She was one of the founding committee members and board members of the Also Foundation, which no longer exists, but it was the gay and lesbian, or firstly gay, community organisations in Melbourne and later gay and lesbian. She was a founding board member there, and it was instrumental in running our community celebrations, such as the Gay Days, the Queen's birthday.
I remember them, yes, and she was there,
yes,
at the centre of it.
Yes, indeed, yes.
Do you think the gay community fulfilled a sense of love and connection that she just couldn't find anywhere else?
Well, perhaps as a woman who never got around to having a child for whatever reason, we were her children. I remember I was in my early 20s when I met her, and at that stage she was a woman in her 50s. So she'd always been surrounded by younger people. So maybe she just needed that energy, that youth, that energy, and the particular type of energy that the queer community, and only the queer community, can give to somebody. Maybe it was that. Maybe she certainly had a need. She had a definite need to be filled with flamboyance. So maybe it was only the drag world that gave her that level of satisfaction and that level of connection with someone who is as flamboyant as Yvonne.
She knew many people who died of AIDS-related illnesses, far too many to count on her fingers.
She probably knew more than most of us, I'd imagine.
Yeah. Did she ever talk to you about the sense of grief that must have given her?
I think the grief was empowering. I think the grief that she experienced from that was the impetus for her to keep working for the community, to keep combating the alien existence of these people who are living with HIV/AIDS, and giving them a sense of place in a community and bringing them into her community, which is why those lunches, particularly Christmas Day, were very, very important for a lot of people over the years, and I'm sure that they will continue. She self-financed those lunches for many, many years until she eventually got a grant to help it along a bit. She shopped at the Preston markets every week for those lunches. Whether there were only 4 people or whether there were 40, it didn't matter. Everyone was fed. Everyone had a place at the table, and everyone was fed.
Brenton, Geyer, thank you for sharing your memories about Yvonne Gardner's life and legacy. And for those listeners who are interested, and I know there many are, the funeral is next Friday.
Next Friday, the 12th of October, 2 p.m. at the Collingwood Town Hall, Hoddle Street, Collingwood. A very appropriate venue. I think it will be busy. The Facebook event says please tick yes, press going, as in by way of an RSVP, because there will be somebody who will be making sandwiches and sausage rolls and cups of tea and glasses of wine, I'm sure. And they'll need to know how many sausage rolls to make. Yvonne's sausage rolls, of course, were legendary. Her chicken sandwiches, unforgettable. I had a birthday event in Bendigo recently where I had 30 people on a train on a V line up to Bendigo to the Marilyn Monroe exhibition when it was on at the Bendigo Art Gallery. And she provided sausage rolls and chicken sandwiches as sustenance on the train on the way up.
That's so Yvonne.
It was very... and she dressed as Marilyn Monroe in Some Like It Hot, you know. So
did the dress go up?
She was right. She was right into it. Whatever she did, she tackled to its extreme. And that's a wonderful way to have lived your life. And I take a lot from that personally and try and emulate her as much as I possibly can in that regard.
Brenton, Guy, thank you for celebrating the life of Yvonne Gardner here on 3CR. 3CR.